In 1823, Ohio was still a young state, carved from the wild frontier and slowly transforming into a network of small farming towns, religious communities, and tightly knit villages. The landscape was rugged yet beautiful, rolling hills, dense forests, and winding dirt roads that often disappeared into thick mists. Life was hard but simple. People depended on one another, trusted in their faith, and feared anything that didn't fit within the pages of their Bible or the limited understanding of frontier medicine. In towns like Chillicothe, Marietta, and the smaller settlements that dotted the southern part of the state, the church was not just a place of worship, it was a place of law, healing, and refuge. If something strange happened, it was to the clergy people turned first. Science was distant. Superstition was immediate. It was in one of these close-knit communities, a village whose name has faded in history, that Margaret lived. She was not known to be extraordinary. In fact, by most accounts, Margaret was plain, polite, and deeply religious. A woman in her late 20s, she lived alone in a modest cabin left to her by her parents, who had died of a fever years earlier. She kept to herself, made her own candles, and grew vegetables behind her cabin. To her neighbors, she was quiet but kind, often leaving extra root vegetables or homemade soaps on porches without asking for anything in return. But even in this small town where everyone knew each other, Margaret never had visitors. No family. No friends who stayed long. And when people spoke of her, there was often a strange pause in their voice, as if they weren't sure how much they really knew about her at all. The town itself was deeply religious, shaped by a mixture of old-world European superstitions and the fervent Protestant revival sweeping the frontier. Tent meetings and open-air sermons were common. Any sickness, bad luck, or sudden death was often seen not just as a medical issue, but as a moral one. Illness might be punishment. Misfortune might be a sign of sin. So when Margaret began acting strangely, people didn't first suspect disease, they suspected something darker. At first, it was subtle. She stopped going to church. A neighbor claimed to see her speaking to someone who wasn't there. At night, odd sounds came from her cabin, rhythmic tapping, low moans, and on one occasion, what someone swore was a scream, cut short. Then came the animals. Dogs refused to go near her land. Horses would buck and resist when led past her property. Chickens stopped laying eggs if they wandered too close. Children were told not to go near Margaret's line, the invisible boundary where her land began. She no longer came into town for supplies. When someone did visit her, usually a concerned neighbor or a member of the congregation, they returned pale, unsettled, saying only that Margaret looked wrong. No one could describe it precisely. Just wrong. Within a few weeks, things escalated. One Sunday morning, a group of boys dared each other to peek into Margaret's window. What they saw wasn't recorded in exact detail, just that she was sitting in total darkness, motionless, staring at the door. She hadn't lit a lamp. She hadn't moved for hours. When they knocked, she didn't react. The boys ran back to town, shaken. That same night, the local pastor tried to visit her. He knocked. He prayed. He called out to her. No answer. But he said he felt something watching him through the wall, something that wasn't quite human. He never returned. In this town, fear traveled fast. The pastor's account, combined with strange weather patterns, livestock deaths, and more unexplainable behavior, pushed the townsfolk to seek medical help. They believed Margaret needed care, though most whispered she needed something else, an exorcism, perhaps. But the town elders decided to remain rational, at least for now. A rider was sent to fetch a doctor from the nearest city. He arrived 2 days later, examined Margaret briefly, and left without saying a word. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He didn't even take his fee. When pressed, he only muttered that something unnatural was happening there. A second doctor came. Then a third. Each one refused to continue treatment, each one unwilling to explain what they saw. And still, Margaret remained in that small cabin. Alone. Unmoving. Staring. And Ohio, for all its prayers and early laws and proud settlers, had no answer for her. Ask ChatGPT. ChatGPT said, Margaret's illness did not begin with a fever or a cough, nor with any of the common ailments that doctors in 1823 Ohio were familiar with. It began with silence. For days at a time, she wouldn't speak to anyone, not even when spoken to directly. When neighbors came to her door to ask if she needed help or supplies, she would simply stare at them through the crack in the wood, her eyes wide, unblinking, as if she was trying to remember who they were, or whether they were real. She stopped tending to her garden. The smoke from her chimney stopped rising. People began to wonder if she was eating at all. Then came the shaking. One woman, a midwife named Esther who once delivered babies in the community, claimed she saw Margaret standing in the middle of her yard during a thunderstorm, her body trembling violently, but not from the cold. Esther said Margaret's arms were stiff by her sides, her hands curled into claws, and her jaw was clenched so tight that her teeth could be heard grinding from 20 feet away. Her clothes were soaked, her eyes rolled back, and still she didn't move to shelter. Esther backed away slowly, praying under her breath the entire time. She never went near Margaret's property again. Inside her home, the symptoms became even stranger. The few townsfolk who dared to enter said the cabin felt like it had been drained of air, stale, thick, and heavy, as if something unseen filled the space. Margaret herself was often found either sitting stiffly in a wooden chair by the fireplace or lying curled up on the floor, whispering words that no one could understand. At times, she would suddenly jolt upright, her eyes darting around the room as if watching things no one else could see. She began to mutter in strange patterns, a cadence that didn't match English or any known dialect. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting, but broken and erratic, gibberish to everyone who heard it. Margaret's physical appearance also began to shift. Her skin lost color, turning an ashen gray, and deep shadows formed beneath her eyes. She grew thinner, but not in a way that seemed natural. Her fingers became bony and elongated, her fingernails thickened and darkened at the edges, almost like they were rotting. Her hair, once dark and neatly braided, turned brittle and uneven, falling out in clumps. And worst of all, her eyes, those who got close enough said they looked wrong. Not just tired or sick, but inhuman. As if something else had begun looking out through them. Local healers tried to explain it. One suggested she had been poisoned by a fungus growing in her well. Another thought perhaps she had suffered a seizure that damaged her mind. But nothing matched her symptoms. There was no fever. No rash. No cough. Her pulse would quicken for hours, then slow so dramatically that people feared she was dead. Her breath would stop entirely for several minutes, only to resume with violent gasps, as if she'd been drowning. Some nights, those who watched over her swore she didn't breathe at all. More disturbing were the moments when Margaret would suddenly speak clearly, but only to say things that made no sense, descriptions of places no one had heard of, warnings about the hollow under the floor, and cryptic statements like, "It crawled into me through the smoke." She'd describe dreams of endless black rooms, of teeth sprouting from the walls, of whispers that scratched the inside of her skull. These were not dreams of an ill woman, they were too vivid, too specific. And always, after one of these episodes, she would fall into a motionless state for hours or days, her body rigid, eyes wide open. Doctors came, summoned from nearby towns by desperate neighbors hoping for a rational explanation. But one by one, they left. The first took her pulse and checked her mouth, only to retreat when Margaret suddenly smiled at him and began describing the death of his sister, an event no one in the town knew about. The second doctor refused to even cross her doorway after peering inside and hearing what he called a voice that didn't belong to her. The third arrived from a larger township and insisted that what they were dealing with was some form of hysteria. But after 10 minutes inside her cabin, he ran out without his coat, face pale, mumbling prayers. Even without a formal diagnosis, the town knew Margaret was suffering. But it wasn't the kind of sickness they could name. It moved too unpredictably, defied the logic of known diseases. One moment she was catatonic, the next she was growling like a wounded animal. Her body would convulse without warning, then go completely limp. Her limbs would lock into unnatural positions, her joints bending at odd angles. And despite her frailty, she would sometimes exhibit bursts of strength, throwing furniture, tearing through heavy blankets, pushing visitors out of her space with terrifying force. There were no remedies, no herbs, no prayers that worked. Every attempt at comfort was met with silence or violence. And as the days turned into weeks, the town began to ask itself a question no one wanted to answer: what if Margaret wasn't just sick? What if this was something else entirely? Those who witnessed Margaret's condition firsthand spoke of phenomena that defied the laws of nature and the limits of human understanding. What she experienced inside that small wooden cabin on the edge of the forest could not be explained by illness or grief alone. It was as though something inside her had awakened, or perhaps entered her, and once it did, her body no longer moved like it belonged to her. It twisted, stretched, convulsed in ways that left even the bravest men speechless. One of the most consistent accounts came from a man named Elias Harper, a blacksmith and one of the first to respond when the town elders decided Margaret needed a watcher. Elias wasn't afraid of much. He had seen men lose limbs in forge fires and survived a war. But nothing had prepared him for the night he stayed inside Margaret's home. He described her as lying still for hours on a cot in the far corner of the room, eyes closed, breathing shallow. But at midnight, she suddenly arched her back off the bed, without bending her knees or using her arms, and hovered there, suspended only by the back of her head and her heels. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Elias swore her joints made a cracking noise, not from pain, but from unnatural strain, as though her bones were shifting into a different shape. When he called out to her, she turned her head 180 degrees without moving her shoulders. Her eyes locked on his, and he said they were completely black, the whites swallowed whole. That night, Elias left without saying a word. He never entered her home again, and for the rest of his life, he refused to speak of Margaret in public. Other witnesses told of Margaret's limbs bending in the wrong directions. She could sit up without moving her legs, fold her arms behind her back in impossible ways, and once, according to a girl who had looked through a window, Margaret crawled up the wall backwards. Her hands and feet gripped the wooden surface like an insect, her body inverted, her face turned toward the ceiling as if something was pulling her upward. When the girl screamed and ran, she tripped and broke her ankle, later telling her parents that Margaret had smiled at her upside down, mouth stretched unnaturally wide. There were also sounds, unmistakable, terrifying sounds that came from her body during these moments. Clicking, popping, groaning sounds, like bones being reshaped. Her spine would bend like a bow. Her fingers, long and gnarled, would snap into stiff angles, holding their position for hours at a time. During one visit, a minister from a nearby town tried to read aloud from the Psalms. As he began, Margaret began to mimic his voice perfectly, mocking, echoing each word he said but in reverse, as if reciting scripture backward. When he reached for her hand to pray over her, she bit him so hard it tore through skin and muscle. He needed 11 stitches and a tetanus treatment, and when he returned to his town, he left the ministry entirely. The townspeople also noticed that during these episodes, the temperature in the cabin would drop sharply. Breath would mist in the air. Candles wouldn't light. The fireplace, even when full of coal and wood, would not catch flame. Some claimed it was just fear clouding their perception, but more than one visitor confirmed the chill in their bones that lasted long after they left the house. Margaret's body would sometimes become rigid, as if frozen in time. Her eyes would blink only once every few minutes. On multiple occasions, townsfolk saw her sit unmoving for an entire day, in the same pose, without food or water, without twitching a single muscle. But then, without warning, she would spring into a burst of motion, pacing in circles rapidly, clawing at the walls, or spinning on the spot until collapsing from exhaustion. During these frenzies, she spoke languages no one recognized. A teacher from out of town who was visiting relatives claimed one of the phrases resembled ancient Latin. Another woman thought she heard German or some dialect from the old country. Others said it didn't sound human at all, like a collection of syllables forced through the throat without thought or purpose. The furniture around her moved too, though no one ever caught her in the act. Tables would be overturned. Chairs smashed. Heavy trunks pushed across the room as if by brute strength. When asked how she managed it, Margaret only smiled or said, "It wasn't me." One young man, who believed the town had overreacted, attempted to bind her hands with cloth to prevent her from hurting herself. Minutes later, he ran out of the cabin bleeding from the face, claiming she had freed herself in one violent twist of her wrists, tearing through the fabric and striking him with unnatural force. What haunted the town most, though, were the moments of calm between the storms. When Margaret sat quietly, looking through people rather than at them, saying things she shouldn't have known, secrets, deaths, sins confessed only in confidence. Her body may have been broken, but her mind seemed to stretch far beyond anything human, like a veil had been lifted and something else was using her as a mouthpiece. And in those moments, no one could deny that whatever was afflicting Margaret was beyond medicine. Beyond reason. Beyond earthly comprehension. Ask ChatGPT. The reactions of the doctors who came to treat Margaret became just as infamous as her condition itself. In a time when medicine was primitive but physicians prided themselves on rationality and courage, what happened in that small Ohio cabin in 1823 stood out as an unsettling anomaly. These were not men prone to panic. They had treated fevers, amputated limbs, and delivered children under candlelight. They had seen disease, infection, madness, and death. But Margaret was different. And the way these doctors responded to her, 3 men from 3 different towns, arriving at separate times, formed a pattern that shook the local community to its core. The first doctor, Elias Grafton, came from a neighboring township. A middle-aged man with a calm disposition, he had built a reputation as a practical and intelligent physician. When summoned by a frantic messenger from Margaret's village, he packed his tools, mounted his horse, and expected to find a case of catatonia or hysteria, conditions he believed were more spiritual exaggerations than medical emergencies. When he arrived, the villagers greeted him with urgency, but also with unease. They didn't push him inside. They didn't plead. They only asked him to see for himself. That hesitation unsettled him more than anything. He entered Margaret's cabin alone. What he saw inside was never written down in detail, but when he emerged less than 20 minutes later, he was visibly shaken. His face was white, his hands trembled, and his lips were pressed into a tight, thin line. He refused the food and drink offered to him, muttered that no medicine could help her, and rode away without charging a fee or even asking for directions. Some say he whispered a prayer under his breath as he left. Others claimed he never spoke of Margaret again, not even to his own family. The second doctor, Jonathan Bell, was a young man fresh from an academy in Pennsylvania. He came with confidence, skeptical of the rumors and superstitions that surrounded Margaret's case. He believed in logic, in science, and in the growing movement of professional medicine that sought to distance itself from old-world fears and folk remedies. When he entered Margaret's home, he expected to find a woman suffering from delusion or trauma. He carried with him opiates, tonic water, surgical instruments, and a journal to document his findings. He insisted that no one else accompany him, thinking the townspeople might influence his observations. What happened inside that cabin shook his confidence to its foundation. Witnesses outside heard no screams, no yelling, only a thud, followed by long, unnatural silence. When he re-emerged, nearly 40 minutes later, his coat was torn, and his right eye had blood pooling underneath it, like a burst vessel. He looked like a man who had just awoken from a nightmare. When asked what had happened, he simply said, "Her voice is not her own." He would not elaborate. He didn't ask for payment. He left town that same afternoon, traveling in the opposite direction from where he had come. He would later abandon his medical career entirely and take up carpentry, reportedly telling his wife years later that some bodies should not be touched. The third doctor, a German immigrant named Dr. Ernst Halbier, was perhaps the most experienced of the three. He was older, with over 2 decades of experience treating patients in both Europe and the American frontier. When summoned, he agreed without hesitation, intrigued more than afraid. His knowledge of both science and folklore gave him a unique perspective. Some say he carried charms in his pocket, remnants of old Bavarian superstitions, just in case. When he entered Margaret's cabin, he did so with quiet observation. He examined her posture, her breathing, her eyes. He noted the condition of the room, the smell in the air, the eerie stillness that clung to the space like fog. Unlike the other two, he remained inside for over an hour. Townspeople waited outside in a tense silence, hoping he would find an answer, or at least stay longer than the others. But when Dr. Halbier emerged, his expression was grim. He didn't speak at first. He stood at the door, staring at the ground, rubbing something between his fingers. When finally asked for his opinion, he responded with a single phrase in his native tongue, "Das ist nicht menschlich." That is not human. He left without explanation, refusing to write any notes, refusing to take any questions. A week later, a letter arrived from his wife in Cincinnati, stating that Dr. Halbier would not be returning to practice. He had taken to bed, shaken, and would not speak of what he had seen. Each of these doctors came with knowledge, tools, and experience. Each left in silence or fear. None provided a diagnosis. None offered a cure. And most tellingly, none returned. The town, already afraid, now understood that what afflicted Margaret was something far outside the realm of medicine. It wasn't just that she couldn't be treated, it was that no one dared to try again. Ask ChatGPT. After the doctors refused to return and the town grew more unsettled by Margaret's worsening condition, whispers began to spread through the village like wildfire. These weren't ordinary rumors born out of boredom or curiosity. These were deep, frightened murmurs, half-spoken at night, exchanged between neighbors while locking doors and shuttering windows. People didn't just think Margaret was sick anymore. They thought something had claimed her. And when no medical explanation could be found, the people turned back to the oldest answers they had, ones forged not in books, but in fear, witchcraft, curses, and demonic possession. The first to speak openly of it was the widow Abigail Moss, one of the oldest residents in the town and a woman deeply steeped in folklore from her Scottish ancestry. She told a group of concerned women one evening that she had seen this kind of affliction before, or at least something like it. Not in Ohio, but in stories from the old country, where women were ridden by spirits, where demons entered through grief or solitude, where curses could cling to the walls of a home for generations. She believed Margaret had either dabbled in something dark or been the victim of someone who had. Her theory was that something ancient had found its way into the young woman's life, possibly through inheritance. A cursed item. A forgotten family debt. A deal broken in the past that now demanded a soul. Soon others began adding fuel to the fire. Someone remembered that Margaret's mother had died suddenly, and that there were strange circumstances around her burial. Another said they once saw Margaret drawing symbols into the dirt behind her cabin. A boy claimed she had spoken to him without moving her lips. And as with all fear-driven speculation, the line between memory and imagination blurred quickly. People swore they heard voices coming from the woods near her property. They spoke of seeing shadows move along the cabin walls even when there was no light. The animals continued to avoid her land. Even birds no longer perched on the trees nearby. The religious leaders of the town grew increasingly involved, though divided in their interpretations. The local pastor initially insisted Margaret was afflicted by madness or grief, perhaps a punishment for some unspoken sin. But after visiting her a second time and hearing her recite verses from scripture backward in a guttural voice, he changed his tone. He stopped holding services near her part of town and began preaching about the dangers of letting Satan into the heart of a home. Others from surrounding churches came to offer help. One itinerant preacher brought a crucifix and attempted to bless her home. He stayed inside for less than 10 minutes before stumbling out with blood on his palms, claiming that Margaret had slashed his hand with nothing visible in her grip. Children were forbidden to walk past her lane. Women refused to fetch water from the well closest to her property. Some men began patrolling the area at night, not to protect her, but to make sure she didn't wander. They spoke of locking her in, of building a fence around her house, of calling upon the governor for outside intervention. But no one wanted to get too close. Fear had built a wall around Margaret that no one dared cross willingly. The strongest belief that took root, however, was that Margaret was not possessed by a demon, but imprisoned by one. That whatever was inside her wasn't her doing, but something she had been trying to fight. Some townspeople claimed they saw moments of clarity, fleeting expressions on her face that looked like sorrow. Not malice, not madness, grief. As if she were still in there, buried beneath the horror, screaming silently for help that no one knew how to give. This interpretation frightened people even more, because it implied that the thing inside her was sentient, aware, and cruel. Not content to simply torment, but to use her, to mock, to deceive, to watch others break down in confusion and fear. Then there were the symbols. One night, a group of boys carved into the frame of her house saw markings just beneath the outer layer of wood, symbols, circles, intersecting lines etched so faintly they had gone unnoticed for years. When the town's schoolteacher saw them, he said they resembled ancient protective wards from European folklore, meant to trap or contain something evil. But if the markings had been meant to hold the thing back, then something had gone terribly wrong. Margaret's past, once ignored, now became a subject of scrutiny. People asked why she had lived alone for so long. Why no one had ever visited her. Why her family history seemed vague, with no surviving relatives to speak of. Some claimed she had been adopted, others whispered that she had come from nowhere, that one day, years ago, she simply appeared, settled into the cabin, and never left. There was no birth record, no marriage, no known origin. As if she had been planted there by something other than fate. A seed waiting to be awakened. When all else failed, and the fear reached its peak, the town began to divide into factions, those who wanted to help her through prayer, those who wanted to cast her out entirely, and those who said it was already too late. The only thing they all agreed upon was this: Margaret's affliction could no longer be explained by the physical world. Something else was at work. Something the land itself seemed to recognize, even if the people didn't. ChatGPT said, Margaret's case became more than a mystery, it became a mirror. As the weeks passed and her condition grew worse, the townspeople found themselves not only fearing what was happening to her, but questioning what it said about them. For all the talk of faith, medicine, and reason, Margaret exposed a raw truth buried beneath the civility of the community. No one knew what to do. No one wanted to admit how powerless they were. And that helplessness made people see things in themselves they hadn't faced before. Some began to revisit sins they'd long buried, wondering if what was happening to Margaret was punishment not for her actions, but for the collective failings of the town. Old grievances between neighbors resurfaced. Family secrets, previously whispered only behind closed doors, were now referenced in public sermons. The fear surrounding Margaret didn't stay locked in her cabin. It seeped into the schoolhouse, the church pews, the market stalls. People began to accuse each other of spiritual weakness. Arguments broke out over whether God was testing them or abandoning them. For the first time in years, the town didn't feel safe, not because of wolves in the woods or highwaymen on the road, but because something inside the community had turned in on itself. Margaret, once seen as a quiet and solitary woman, had become the center of everything. People projected onto her their fears, their guilt, their beliefs. To some, she was a victim of demonic torment. To others, she was a witch harboring dark power. A few believed she was cursed through no fault of her own, but others insisted she must have invited it in. But almost no one saw her as human anymore. The longer her suffering continued, the less she resembled a person to them. She had become a symbol. A warning. A problem to solve, or eliminate. Those closest to the church began pushing for a final act, an exorcism or, failing that, isolation. Complete separation. There were discussions of building a makeshift structure deeper in the woods and moving her there, so the town could sleep again without the shadow of her presence. Others suggested she be taken to a larger city for institutional care, though the last doctor to examine her had written privately that, "No asylum in this country is prepared to handle what dwells in that woman." His words only deepened the dread. And still, Margaret lingered. She did not die, though her body grew weaker by the day. She did not speak often, though when she did, her words became more chilling, more precise. She spoke of people's dreams, describing things no one had told her. She named the dead in perfect order and recalled events she could not have witnessed. A farmer's wife fled her bedside in tears after Margaret described, in perfect detail, the exact sound of her husband's voice when he died in a barn accident 6 years earlier. Another man claimed she told him the date of his brother's suicide, news he hadn't received yet. When he returned home, the letter was waiting for him. These incidents forced even the most skeptical minds to reconsider. The schoolteacher, who once mocked the talk of spirits, stopped showing up to class. He reportedly went blind overnight after confronting Margaret in her cabin and accusing her of deception. An elder who tried to organize her removal suffered a seizure on the church steps. Coincidence, some said. Divine retribution, others whispered. Margaret never left her bed, but the town bent around her like metal pulled toward a magnet. What her case revealed, more than anything, was how thin the barrier truly was between certainty and chaos. In a town built on faith and community, one woman's torment shattered the illusion of order. People thought they had answers for everything. That prayer could fix the soul, that science could fix the body. But Margaret's suffering belonged to neither category. And faced with something that defied understanding, the community cracked. Their reactions, fear, blame, withdrawal, superstition, said more about them than it ever did about Margaret. The children, who were initially kept far away, began to make up rhymes and games about her. They called her the woman who waits and dared each other to approach her house. One girl claimed to hear music from inside, a lullaby sung by a voice that didn't sound like it belonged to any woman at all. Parents tried to shield their families, but the fear was generational now, passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. Margaret had become woven into the town's identity. Her house, once seen as an ordinary log cabin, now stood like a scar at the edge of the village. People crossed the road to avoid its view. The local pastor refused to walk past it after sunset. Travelers were warned not to go near it, told only that a sickness lived there. Yet no one burned it down. No one tried to end it by force. As much as they feared her, they feared what would happen if they interfered more directly. She remained untouched, unmoved, but never forgotten. The longer Margaret endured, the more her case peeled away the layers of logic and comfort that the town had wrapped around itself. It left behind the truth no one wanted to say aloud, that something had arrived, something beyond explanation, and it had chosen a quiet, ordinary woman as its vessel. And no one, not the wisest doctor or the holiest priest, could do anything to stop it. 6.